Welcome to the Restricted Handling Daily Intel Brief. Let's dig in. Here's what's been going on in Russia in the last 24 hours. Russian President Vladimir Putin is preparing for a longer and potentially more intense conflict rather than moving toward a negotiated settlement. Reporting from sources familiar with Kremlin thinking indicates that Putin remains focused on achieving control over the remaining Ukrainian-held territory in Donetsk and views that objective as necessary for any definition of victory. That matters because it suggests Moscow is not treating current battlefield conditions as a reason to compromise. Instead, the Kremlin appears to believe that continued pressure can eventually force Ukraine or its supporters to make concessions. This is a familiar pattern from Russia's approach throughout the war: absorb pressure, adjust tactics, and bet that political patience in the West eventually runs out. But while Putin is focused outward, the war is increasingly creating internal challenges. One of the clearest examples is Russia's growing fuel problem. Ukraine's campaign against Russian energy infrastructure is producing effects that are much broader than individual strikes. The issue is not simply whether a refinery is damaged or a tanker is hit. The larger question is whether Russia can protect the industrial systems that keep its economy and military moving. Over the past several days, Ukrainian strikes have hit Russian oil facilities, fuel storage sites, and maritime supply routes. The response from Moscow has been significant. Russia has temporarily banned diesel exports in an effort to stabilize domestic supplies. Deputy Prime Minister Alexander Novak acknowledged that the situation at fuel stations was causing public concern and announced additional measures, including plans to import fuel. For a country that remains one of the world's largest energy producers, having citizens deal with fuel shortages is politically uncomfortable. It creates a difficult message for the Kremlin. Russia says it is a global energy powerhouse, but ordinary people are increasingly seeing the costs of a war that was originally presented as distant and controlled. That disconnect is becoming a bigger challenge for Moscow. Reports from inside Russia describe increasing frustration over fuel lines, infrastructure disruptions, drone attacks, and uncertainty about whether another mobilization effort could happen. The concern is not necessarily that Russia is on the verge of political collapse. The Kremlin's security apparatus remains extremely effective. The issue is that the government's ability to insulate society from the consequences of the war is being tested. This is especially important because Putin's political image has long been built around stability. After the chaos of the 1990s, the promise was that the state would provide order, security, and predictability. The longer the war continues, the harder it becomes to maintain that image when people are dealing with practical problems like fuel availability and damaged infrastructure. The Kremlin is responding the way authoritarian systems often do: controlling the narrative and emphasizing resilience. One example is the increased promotion of state-backed organizations like the Cossack movement. Historically tied to Russian military identity, Cossack groups are being highlighted by the Kremlin as symbols of patriotism, social cohesion, and national strength. It is an effort to show that Russian society remains unified and capable of absorbing pressure. At the same time, Russia is continuing to adapt to Ukraine's evolving military strategy. Ukraine's long-range drone campaign has become one of the most consequential developments of the war because it challenges a fundamental Russian assumption: that distance provides protection. Facilities that once seemed safely behind the lines are now vulnerable. Russia is attempting to respond with electronic warfare, camouflage, and changes to its logistics networks. Ukrainian operators report that Russian forces are deploying systems designed to interfere with Starlink connections used by Ukrainian drones. They are also hiding military supplies in civilian-looking vehicles, dispersing fuel shipments, and changing transportation patterns to make detection more difficult. This is becoming a high-speed technology competition. Ukraine finds a new way to exploit a vulnerability. Russia develops a countermeasure. Ukraine adapts again. The battlefield is increasingly shaped by whoever can innovate faster. That same competition is now extending into the industrial base. At the NATO summit in Ankara, President Donald Trump announced that the United States would allow Ukraine to produce Patriot interceptor missiles under license. This is one of Kiev's most significant requests because Patriot remains the primary system capable of defending against Russian ballistic missiles. The announcement is strategically important, but the timeline remains uncertain. Advanced weapons production is complicated, and Ukraine still needs interceptors immediately. Building a domestic or European production capability is about solving the long-term problem, not necessarily the immediate one. The broader lesson from this war is that industrial capacity has become a strategic weapon. Countries can have advanced technology, but if they cannot produce enough of it quickly, that technology has limited impact. Ukraine is trying to address that challenge by expanding defense partnerships across Europe. Kyiv recently signed agreements with Estonia, the Netherlands, and Denmark, focused on drone cooperation and joint production. Ukraine is essentially exporting battlefield lessons learned from more than 4 years of war, particularly in unmanned systems and electronic warfare. The NATO summit also highlighted a broader alliance challenge. Europe is increasing defense spending and support for Ukraine, but questions remain about long-term dependence on U.S. capabilities and the future shape of Western security commitments. Russia is using that uncertainty to pressure NATO members politically. Moscow has increased warnings toward countries that are among Ukraine's strongest supporters, particularly Finland and the Baltic states. Russian officials have criticized Finland's decision to remove restrictions on hosting or transiting nuclear weapons and have warned that such moves create security threats for Russia. The goal is familiar: create uncertainty inside the alliance and test whether NATO countries remain willing to accept the risks associated with supporting Ukraine. Beyond military pressure, Russia continues operating in the intelligence and cyberspace. Ukraine's security services announced they disrupted an alleged Russian intelligence effort to place a Moscow-linked figure into a senior Ukrainian energy sector position. Ukrainian officials said the operation was designed to gain influence over critical infrastructure decisions and obtain sensitive information. Russia, meanwhile, continues expanding internal counterintelligence operations. Authorities announced arrests of individuals accused of assisting Ukrainian intelligence efforts, including alleged transfers of information about military facilities and air defense systems in Crimea. The cyber battlefield remains active as well. Spanish authorities recently arrested an individual accused of supporting Russian-aligned hacktivist groups linked to disruptive cyber operations against countries supporting Ukraine. These groups have become part of Russia's broader pressure campaign against Western governments and institutions. On the battlefield itself, the situation remains intense, but largely attritional. Russian forces continue offensive operations in eastern Ukraine, but have struggled to achieve major breakthroughs. Ukraine is increasingly focused on disrupting Russian logistics, artillery, and command networks rather than simply contesting every kilometer of territory. Thanks for listening and for being part of this community. If you want to support the show, leaving a review or a thoughtful comment helps others discover it. We also share a daily written intel brief on Substack, restrictedhandling.substack.com, where we go deeper on Russia and China, along with broader coverage of Iran, the Middle East, and the DPRK. Wishing you a great day ahead.